Today's lesson is a tax on light and air. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to be talking about taxes, which we all have to pay if we're working. Usually we pay income tax, but sometimes we pay other kinds of tax as well. But here's a kind of strange tax that they had in England at one point. It's a tax on light and air. My goodness, if you had a lot of light or air in your house, you could actually pay more money in taxes.
It's actually a little bit more interesting than that. I don't know how they would tax light and air. It was a tax more on windows and things like that. But it is a very interesting tax. I'm glad they don't have that today, although certain companies with their large glass skyscrapers, they would be in big trouble. But back in the old days, a tax on light and air. How do they tax air? That one's even harder to understand. Let's find out more about it, though, by getting into our article. And also, as we read the article, we can be thankful that they don't have this tax, at least, anymore. A tax on light and air. From a Roman levy on the sale of human urine to a Russian toll on beards, history is full of peculiar taxes. One of the weirdest of these unusual taxes was the window tax. Implemented in England in 1696, the tax was intended to be a progressive tax, meaning one that charges the wealthy higher rates than the poor. It was designed based on the idea that the richer you were, the more windows your house would possess.
大家好，第一部分介绍动词 implement， 它的意思是实施或是履行。例如 It took several weeks to fully implement the recycling program across the city. 该城市花了好几周的时间，好全面实施这个回收计划。或者 The new laws will be implemented next year. 新法将于明年实施。
Okay, so let's talk about strange taxes over the world, and then we'll introduce our topic, the window tax in England. We got a range of different kinds of taxes, from a Roman levy on the sale of human urine to a Russian toll on beards. History is full of peculiar taxes.
Wow.
Now, of course, the government charges us for various kinds of services, so those are usually taxes, like income tax, as I said. But we also have the word levy, which is also a word for tax. It's less common. Don't say you need to pay your levies at the end of the year. No, you pay your taxes, but a levy is a certain kind of fee that you have to pay for something. And in Rome, they had a levy on the sale of human urine. So if you sold someone's pee, you had to pay a tax on that. I guess at the time, people thought urine was valuable for some reason.
They used it for dyeing clothes.
Oh, they did? Okay. I've heard
for,
someone actually drinking urine too.
Oh, my goodness.
But in any case here, that was a tax that they had in Rome. And then we've got something in Russia. There's a toll on beards. A toll, again, is a kind of tax you pay, but usually the word toll refers to money you pay to use a highway. So a long time ago, you used to have to pay tolls at various points on the freeways here in Taiwan. You'd slow down and give them 40 NT, and they'd give you a little ticket or something like that. Now it's all electronic. You pay your tolls electronically, but in Russia, you had to pay a toll on your beard. I don't like having beards, so I guess I wouldn't have to pay this tax, but still, if you did have a beard in Russia, you'd probably have to pay a little money just to have that thing.
Interesting. Or maybe you would have to pay a tax because you're so rich you can shave, and the poor people can't. How do you impose a tax
why they had that,
on beards? And we can also use levy as a verb, right? To levy a tax. The government has decided to levy a tax on fast food in order to improve people's health or something like that. So there we are, government finding all sorts of interesting and weird ways to collect money from the population. And of course, these taxes hopefully are being used for good things that will benefit everyone. Good things that the government is spending our money or our taxes on. Here's one of the weirdest, though. One of the weirdest of these unusual taxes was the window tax. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking about in our article. That is the tax on light, a window tax. When did this happen? What was going on? It says implemented in England in 1696, the tax was intended to be a progressive tax. What is a progressive tax? Well, it says, meaning one, a tax that charges the wealthy higher rates than the poor. Okay, I think most of us can get behind that, especially if we're not wealthy people. So this was implemented, this was put into effect, this was used. In other words, the law was proposed and passed in Parliament and put into effect, put into force in England back in 1696. So don't worry, I don't think it still exists anymore. And it was intended as a progressive tax. What do we mean by a progressive tax? Well, as it says, it's one that charges or gets more money from the wealthy than it does from the poor. So in other words, if you had a lot of money and I guess a lot of windows, you would be paying a much higher tax than if you were poor and lived in a smaller house with smaller or fewer or even no windows. Okay, I think that sounds fair.
So far, yes, it seems to make sense there, but as we're going to find out, there were some flaws in this particular idea.
Oh, there always are.
There are, but in any case, we got to go back to the word implement here, which means to put something into effect, to start using this particular policy. I have a question. When was Taiwan's helmet law implemented? When did they start requiring people riding motorcycles to wear helmets? There was a time when you didn't have to, but now you do. So yeah, when was that law implemented? When did it come into effect? And again, this law in England was implemented or it came into effect way back in 1696. It was supposed to be a progressive tax, which we're all paying now, right? Poor people pay less tax than rich people, but rich people always figure out ways to get out of tax. But in any case, it was designed based on the idea that the richer you were, the more tax you should pay, and then you would probably have more windows in your house as well. That was the assumption.
That was the assumption. Of course, yeah, sometimes we pay fewer taxes if we're poor, but things like sales tax, that's the same for everyone, no matter how much money you have. So the law was designed based on the idea that the richer you were, the more windows your house would possess, because that was kind of the reality of it. We could maybe do a tax today based on how big your house is or something like that, or what neighborhood you live in. Wealthier neighborhoods, bigger houses would pay more tax than smaller houses in poorer neighborhoods. Let's get back to the article and we'll move on to part 2 and we'll find out exactly how this law was used. The law was simple. Every household was expected to pay at least 2 shillings annually. Beyond that, those who owned a property with 10 to 20 windows were charged an additional 4 shillings. Moreover, an extra 8 shillings were charged to those owning a property with more than 20 windows. Though these differences may not seem very significant today, the sum was considered a lot of money at the time. Therefore, in response to the law, some homeowners began bricking up windows or covering them in plaster to avoid the higher tax rates. This practice had a negative impact, particularly in urban areas. Poor city dwellers typically resided in large apartment buildings known as tenements. To avoid paying the window tax, the owners of these tenements also covered their windows. This forced many of the impoverished people in England's cities to rent rooms with poor ventilation and lighting. Deadly diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis spread with ease in these dirty living conditions. Meanwhile, some owners simply increased their rents to offset the higher tax rates, thereby passing on the cost to their tenants.
第二部分看到动词 reside 表示居住或是定居。例如 The majority of the country's population resides in the capital city. 该国大部分人口居住在首都。或是 Paul was born in Japan, but he currently resides in Taiwan. Paul 出生于日本，但目前居住在台湾。接着看到形容词 deadly， 它的意思是致命的或是致死的。例如 Sean was bitten by a deadly snake. Sean 被一条致命的毒蛇咬了。也可以说 The earthquake triggered a deadly tsunami. 地震引起了致命的海啸。再来介绍副词 thereby 表示从而或是因此。我们可以说 Tim became a U.S. citizen, thereby gaining the right to vote. Tim 成为美国公民，从而获得了投票权。又或者说 The new law reduced pollution, thereby improving the city's air quality. 那条新法减少了污染，因此改善了那个城市的空气品质。
Okay, so again, we're talking about the window tax in England, and the law was simple. Every household was expected to pay at least 2 shillings annually. A household is just a home where people live. And beyond that, those who owned a property with 10 to 20 windows were charged an additional 4 shillings. A shilling is a unit of money. I believe it's 1/20th of a pound or something like that.
So 12 pence, I believe.
Yes, that's how the tax worked. So if your house had 10 to 20 windows, then you had to pay 4 shillings in taxes.
Interesting. Of course, that would have amounted to a lot of money back then. Beyond that, so beyond those people who had a few windows in their household, those who owned a property with 10 to 20 windows, so a larger number, were charged an additional 4 shillings. Remember, back then, glass was really expensive. So just the fact that you had glass in your windows and you had enough money to have many windows with lots of glass, that kind of showed that you were doing pretty well. You were pretty well off. You had quite a lot of money, so taking a bit more tax from you seemed like not a bad thing to do. Moreover, an extra 8 shillings were charged to those owning a property with more than 20 windows. So you can imagine some of those stately homes, those manor houses and estates that the very wealthiest people lived on would definitely have had more than 20 windows, and so they would have definitely been paying a lot more tax under this law. Though these differences may not seem very significant today, the sum was considered a lot of money at the time, right? Any person can probably pay this kind of tax. If you still were using the old system, you could pay it with the coins in your pocket, the loose change in your pocket. It's much less than a couple of pounds, for example, but the sum, this amount, was considered a lot of money at the time. This would have been like thousands of pounds or tens of thousands of NT dollars today.
Right, and that sum or that amount of money was considered a lot at the time, and therefore, as a result, in response to the law, some homeowners began bricking up windows or covering them in plaster to avoid the higher tax rates. So everybody's trying to get out of paying taxes, and the government should have thought of this, but this is how people tried to get out of paying the tax. They began to brick up their windows. So if you brick something up, you just take bricks, which are rectangular pieces made out of clay that you can build things with, and they would just put those bricks in the windows so they could say, hey, we don't have a window here because there's actually a brick wall here. And also they would cover them in plaster, which is kind of a construction material where you mix things together, lime and sand and cement and water, and then you spread this on walls or ceilings, and then you'll have this smooth, hard surface as a result. So yeah, they would plaster in the windows or brick them up, and therefore they would not have to pay that tax.
So that would be not a big deal if you lived in a big home with lots of windows. You cover up a couple of the windows, right? You avoid paying the higher taxes. But as we read at the end of this paragraph here, this practice had a negative impact, particularly in urban areas. So not a big deal if you live in a big, light-filled country home and you're very, very wealthy. But this practice, this activity, or doing this, bricking up windows, had a negative impact, particularly in urban areas. So in the countryside, not a big deal. In the city, in urban areas, it could cause real problems, especially for poor folks. Poor city dwellers typically resided in large apartment buildings known as tenements. So in the city, as today, a lot of people, especially poor people, were packed in very closely, living in very close conditions, living in very small homes. If you live in a place, you could be described as a dweller. So a city dweller lives in the city. A farm dweller could be a farmer living out in the countryside. A home dweller has their own home. An apartment dweller lives in a smaller home, in an apartment, that kind of thing. So city dwellers, or people lived in cities, typically resided or lived. When we use reside, we're talking more about where you make your home, where your bed is, where your property is, where you go home and sleep at night. I reside in an apartment. I used to reside in Kaohsiung, but then I moved to Taipei for a job. Now I reside in Taipei, or something like that. So poor city folks typically lived in large apartments apartment buildings known as tenements. We still use this term for very crowded and probably not very well-maintained places in the city, in probably the poor urban areas of the city where a lot of people live. Tenements these days aren't found so much in the West. We have laws and health laws and safety laws, but if you go to poorer countries, or if you look at pictures from old times like Victorian London 150 or so years ago, a lot of poor folks lived in tenements. They were very dangerous. Fires, disease, crowding, crime, a lot of terrible living conditions like that.
Okay, so to avoid paying the window tax, the owners of these tenements also covered their windows, which doesn't sound good.
No.
This forced many of the impoverished people in England's cities to rent rooms with poor ventilation and lighting. So if you're impoverished, you're very poor, you're suffering from poverty, and if you brick up those windows, you'll have poor ventilation, the air won't circulate very well, and of course, it won't be very light inside there. You'll have a lot of darkness in there, and deadly diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis spread with ease in these dirty living conditions. If something's deadly, it can cause death. You can die from that particular disease, and so therefore these poor people were suffering probably more than the rich people, and if something happens with ease, it just happens easily.
So, of course, the landowners were looking to not pay the tax, but then maybe they owned other buildings with lots of windows. They still had to face a much higher tax bill, so some of these owners did other things in order to avoid the cost. It says, meanwhile, some owners simply increased their rents to offset the higher tax rates. We'll keep the windows, or maybe we won't keep the windows, but we'll still raise your taxes because we can. They did this to offset, to sort of avoid the major problems caused by these higher tax rates. When you offset something, you're kind of moving it to another area to make it fit a little bit better, especially with accounting. You might move something to next year, and we won't pay those taxes until next year, or we won't count those losses until next year. We're kind of moving the numbers around to make our financial situation look better. And so they would offset this by raising rents, thereby passing on the cost to their tenants. And of course, this has happened a lot, right? We've noticed that things have been getting more expensive. As food gets more expensive, restaurant prices go up, and we're helping the owners of the restaurant to pay their higher bills. Thereby, by doing this, by raising their rents, the landowners, the property owners, the landlords are passing on the cost to the tenants. Thereby, they are passing on, or kind of giving, this extra tax bill. It's not something they will pay. It's something that the tenants, the people who rent their apartments, will be paying for them. So, as with a lot of things, the trouble trickled down from the rich down to the very poor, and the poor were expected to pay the bill.
Okay, let's move on now to the third and final part. We'll listen to it first.
It comes as little surprise that the window tax was highly unpopular for the entire duration of its existence. But, shockingly, it was not abolished until 1851, when rising tensions forced the government to roll back the tax once and for all. Today, evidence of the notorious tax can still be found across England on historic buildings. If you look closely, you can see that many still have windows filled in with bricks or other materials, the scars of one of history's strangest tax laws.
第三部分看到名词 duration， 它的意思是持续时间或是期间。例如 Due to the rain, all activities will be held indoors for the duration of the fair. 由于下雨，市集期间所有的活动都会在室内举办。又或者说 I watched an exciting tennis match that had a duration of over 4 hours. 我看了一场有4个多小时且激励人心的网球比赛。继续看到动词 abolish， 指的是废除、废止制度或是习俗。举例来说 Some people want to abolish the outdated law. 有些人希望可以废除那条过时的法律。又或者说 The unpopular law was abolished last year. 那条不受欢迎的法规在去年被废除了。最后看到名词 scar， 它表示伤疤、伤痕或是疮疤的意思。我们可以说 The doctor said that the cut would leave a thin scar when it healed. 医生说，伤口愈合后会留下细细的疤痕。也可以说 That old tree has a scar from when it was struck by lightning many years ago. 那棵老树上有多年前雷击造成的痕迹。
Okay, here in the final part it says, it comes as little surprise, it's not at all surprising, that the window tax was highly unpopular for the entire duration of its existence. Duration just means how long something lasted, how long it was in effect. And yes, indeed, it was in existence for a long time, but shockingly, it was not abolished until 1851. My goodness, that's over 100 years. To abolish something just means to get rid of a particular law. The law was abolished in 1851. It was no longer valid. And that happened when rising tensions forced the government to roll back the tax once and for all. So yeah, to roll back is similar in meaning to abolish. They just got rid of this particular tax, and they did it once and for all. They did it forever. It would never exist again.
So that's a good thing. Today, evidence of the notorious tax can still be found across England on historic buildings. If you look closely, you can see that many still have windows filled in with bricks or other materials. They might have plastered over them or filled them in with wood or something. And these are the scars of one of history's strangest tax laws. Scars are physical signs that some kind of damage has occurred. This is something we take basically from biology, from medicine. If you cut yourself very badly, if you get a deep cut, and especially if you have to sort of have it sewn shut, if you have to have stitches in your cut, it probably won't fully heal the way a small cut will. If you cut yourself with a small knife, you might notice in a month or so that there's no more mark on your skin, but a scar will be a permanent mark on your skin caused by the damage, caused by the injury or the surgery or whatever you have. And we can also use it to talk about evidence of some kind of human activity. If you go around the battlefields of France and Belgium, you can still see holes and markings from bombs from World War I and II. These would be scars from the great wars of the early 20th century, signs of things that happened before.
Yep, it was a notorious tax. It was famous for a bad reason. And of course, the scars are still there. So if you go to England, look for some bricked up windows. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Here comes Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 今天要来练习文意选填的题型。那我们先快速的浏览题目10个选项。 A 选项 sum 它可以当名词或动词，当名词表示金额总数，当动词呢通常会搭配 up， sum up 就是总结。 B designed 这个 design 当动词是设计的意思，那在这边它有可能是过去式啊，过去分词，或者是以过去分词来当形容词用。那么 C breaking up 它表示用砖块封住，它是做及物用，它可能是动名词或现在分词。那么 D 选项 charges 它可以是复数可数名词或者是单数动词。那 charge 当名词表示收费费用，当动词表示收费要价。E unpopular 是形容不受欢迎的。F practice 可以当名词或动词，当名词可以指惯常做法、惯例、练习、实施、实践等等。那么当动词可以表达练习、实行等等。那么 G passing on 它可以表达传染、传播、传递或是转嫁，是做及物用，它可能是动名词或现在分词。那么 H 选项 ease 它可以当名词或动词，当名词表示容易、舒适、轻松、自在。那么注意它是不可数名词哦。那 ease 还可以当动词，表示减轻、缓和。再来看到 I 选项 household 这是个名词，表示家庭、户或是一家人。接着看到 J 选项 impoverish 表示使穷困，那在这边有可能是它的过去式或过去分词。以过去分词来当形容词的话，它可以形容是穷困的、赤贫的或是浩劫的。好，那现在看完选项，我们就来做题目吧。第一个题目它提到 The tax was intended to be a progressive tax, meaning one that 空格 the wealthy higher rates than the poor。 空格是出现在修饰先行词 one 的形容词子句里。从句子结构判断，空格里面要填入及物动词。那么 one 指的是前面提到的累进税， progressive tax。然后呢 meaning one that 点点点是在说明累进税，并且陈述事实，所以空格里面应该要填入第三人称单数动词。那符合的选项只有 D charges 收费要价，而且它是符合语义的，是表达说累进税是对富人征收的税率高于穷人的税，所以这是个正确答案。那第二题他提到 It was 空格 based on the idea that the richer you were, the more windows your house would possess。 从句子结构来看，空格前面有 it was， 后面有 based on the idea that 点点点，这可以视为独立分词片语。那我们推测空格可能是要填入不可数名词、形容词或者是分词。符合的选项有 B designed， E unpopular， F practice，H ease， 还有 J impoverished。 那根据句意最适合会是 B designed， 表示它的设计是根据这个概念，你越富有，你的房子拥有的窗户就越多。那第三题他提到 every 空格 was expected to pay 点点点，那空格前面有形容词 every， 后面有 was， 可以得知空格里面要填入单数可数名词。符合的选项有 A some， F practice， I household。 那根据句意答案应该要选 I household 来表达每户每年至少要支付什么什么。好，那么第四题他提到说 The 空格 was considered a lot of money at the time， 那空格前面有 the， 那么后面是 was， 可以得知空格要填入单数名词。符合的选项有 A some， F practice， H ease。 那根据句意答案应该要选 A some 来表达说这个金额被认为是一大笔钱。再看到第五题他说 Some homeowners began 空格 windows or covering them in plaster to avoid the higher tax rates。 从句子结构来看，空格前面有 began， 后面有名词 windows， 后方还有对等连接词or 还有 covering them in 点点点，所以呢空格应该填入做及物用的动名词。符合的选项有 C breaking up， 还有 G passing on。 那根据语义答案应该要选 C breaking up， 去表达用砖块封掉窗户的意思。再看到第六题他说 This 空格 had a negative impact， 那么空格前面有 this， 后面有 had， 我们可以得知空格应该要填入单数名词。符合的选项有 F practice， H ease。 那根据句意答案应该要选 F practice 来表达这种做法产生了负面影响。那第七题他说 This forced many of the 空格 people in England's cities to rent rooms with poor ventilation and lighting。 空格前面是 many of the， 后面是 people。 从句子结构判断，空格应该填入形容词或者是用作修饰的分词。符合的选项有 E unpopular， 还有 J impoverished。 那根据句意答案应该要选 J impoverished 来表达这迫使英格兰城市的许多弱势民众承租通风和采光都很差的房间。第八题他提到 Deadly diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis spread with 空格 in these dirty living conditions。空格前方有 with， 后面是接 in these dirty living conditions。 从句子结构判断，空格应该填入名词来跟这个 with 构成副词片语。符合的选项只有 H ease， 那 with ease 就是指轻而易举地、从容自在地，就相当于 easily。 用在题目句子里面，它就是要表达说在这些肮脏的生活环境中，天花和肺结核等致命的疾病很容易传播。好，第九题他说 Meanwhile, some owners simply increase their rents to offset the higher tax rates, thereby 空格 the cost to their tenant。 这个句子里面没有连接词，那么后半句也没有看到主词，从句子结构判断，后半句应该是分词构句。那空格前方的 thereby 是副词，空格后面是 the cost。 根据句意这边应该要填入及物，表示主动的现在分词。符合的选项只有 G passing on， 而且它符合语义，在这边表达说将成本转嫁给房客。第十题他说 It comes as little surprise that the window tax was highly 空格 for the entire duration of its existence。 从句子结构判断，空格前面有 was highly， 后面是介系词片语 for the entire duration of its existence。 那可以判断空格里面要填入形容词或分词。符合的选项只剩下了 E unpopular， 而且符合语义，意思就是说窗户税在它存在期间一直非常不受欢迎，这件事并不足为奇。那么以上是今天的讲解，我们就来回顾今天的单字吧。
Tall
Drivers taking the new highway will be charged a toll that will help pay for repairs to the road. Implement. The restaurant has implemented a new order management system to reduce customer waiting times. Reside. Wanda resides in the countryside because she finds life more peaceful there. Deadly. The flood proved deadly when several people drowned. Thereby. Clarissa strictly followed the exercise routine, thereby achieving her fitness goals. Tenant. Marvin is a responsible tenant who always pays the rent on time. Abolish. People cheered when the government voted to abolish the unpopular law. Scar. The fire left a thick black scar that cut across much of the forest.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.